Welcome back to the Brella Virtual Studio. And this next session is a rather special one. It's about designing content experiences for the future. I'm delighted to welcome Lauren Laino from Amplified Event Strategy to the studio. Welcome, Lauren, first of all.
Hi, thanks so much, Ralph, for having me today.
So, Lauren, I think I should just tell people a little bit about your background and about your business. So you run your own business now, which you've been doing for nearly 8 years. And before that, you were working in fintech, running events, running big budgets, and now you're helping people with their events. Can you just tell us a little bit about your work at Amplified Event Strategy?
Sure. My background is a trained lawyer and working with the financial services industries prior. The Securities Industry Financial Markets Association really helped me identify that a lot of in-house teams don't have experts and capabilities when it comes to commercializing content. And so what I did when I went out on my own was really find different organizations that could use a bit of a fixer in terms of looking at agendas and the commercialization of agendas for audiences. And working specifically in blockchain and crypto, we've been able to hit a bit of a niche there in developing some great content experiences that translate.
Well, before we delve into crypto, blockchain, fintech, all of these fascinating areas, because there are a lot of really interesting events taking place in that space, I want to talk about the challenges first of all. So we've seen some pretty catastrophic disasters going on. I think I'll start with the Golden Globes. What do you think are some of the challenges to pivoting? Because I know you've actually helped some of the speakers that we've had on before. So for example, CoinDesk, you've helped them in the past with their content strategy, pivoting to virtual, and I'll come on to hybrid in a second, but just tell us what you're seeing. What are some of the trends?
Well, I think it's interesting to see like last May where we stood, and pivoting really just meant surviving. And so we took a look at content. And so for CoinDesk specifically and working with the content team, we had planned out a lot of the 4-day agenda, 250 to 300 speakers prior to COVID hitting. So then how do you really pivot and change that strategy for people sitting at home on Zoom or on Brella in that case, to watch it and say, this is like something that we had in person. Now what we're seeing is that the bar is raised. And I look at it and say to myself, we can't hold the same kind of pivot or events that we had last May. We now have to engage the audience who suffered what I would call a great deal of Zoom fatigue. So looking at that, we have to kind of look at content in a way that makes it more bite-sized. And so one of the challenges I think we face as organizers is that we get that speaker who just really wants to go that extra half hour. Literally, they're asking for 45 minutes, or literally they're asking for another 10 minutes. And they're not getting that people aren't really watching or engaging at home. So I think it's turning your conferences into more newsy, bite-sized pieces that the audience can take and learn from.
Well, you talk about content experiences. So let's have a little look at the Golden Globes, first of all, and what happened to Daniel Kaluuya.
I wish I could hear.
Is this on? Is this on? All right, cool. Can you hear me now? All right, cool. We got this. We got this.
So Hollywood budget, big disaster. I mean, headlines like, this has been, well, basically an absolute disaster, according to the Telegraph, 1 star out of 5. I mean, should that happen in this environment? Is this just a factor of, sorry, you're on mute, or the internet not working properly? How do you get around things like that? How do you do better, I suppose, is the question.
Well, as an organizer, we all feel for one another when things like that happen. However, I would say that there's a lot of prep that goes into this. And if there's one thing that I relate to all organizers, to sit and say, what's plan B? And you have that minute or two with that speaker before they're going up on stage or on screen and saying to them, you know what, if something doesn't work, think of this, here's what you should do. And in that moment, having a freeze like that, having something go on mute, being in the entertainment industry and not having a plan B that was a bit more engaging with the audience that I think all of us at home could have totally identified. I mean, who hasn't been on mute or who hasn't had a technical difficulty? But the fact that, they are in Hollywood and couldn't figure that out made me feel a little bit better as a homegrown organizer.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, going back to the CoinDesk experience, that was on Brella. It was over 20,000 people registered. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about kind of global expansion. Were CoinDesk going to get that many people at their event before COVID? Was this kind of a new opportunity to expand into new markets, into new geographies?
I think it's definitely a new opportunity. So with CoinDesk, they had a heavy international attendance and one of the highest years was around 8,000 folks. So certainly having over 22,000 people umbrella enabled the group to really get a reach out to people that might not have made it to New York in past years. And so we're seeing the virtual world really expanding our options in terms of the kinds of audience that wouldn't be able to maybe get on the plane from Singapore, but now can experience your content in different ways, from their own home.
So one of the big words of the moment is hybrid. What do you think about all this talk about hybrid events and the change that's coming?
I cringe a little bit because we're not talking about a car. We're talking about an experience. And I think that when you look at the event business, we're building experiences for everyone that possibly can come there, from the most shy person to the most outgoing, to one who wants to be educated, to someone who wants to network. There's so many different personas that we're looking to cater to. And so when I look at this term hybrid, I really want clients and I want people in the event industry to think about what type of experience are you building? It's almost as if you're kind of building a journey in different journeys. The journey for the in-person and the journey for the at-home are two journeys that should be integrated. There's integration to talk about. It's not hybrid. This isn't just a mashup of two different worlds. It's integrating how that person at home is going to ask that same question to the audience while that audience member is sitting there. It's almost like, think about the NBA finals when they had their fans in the background. How do you pull that fan up who has a great question for that speaker and put them on stage with the speaker as if they were sitting in the audience? We have to think about those real-time production capabilities when we're looking at different production partners and different opportunities. I mean, call a friend from home kind of thing, and then all of a sudden someone shows up with a question. I just think that you get a lot of people at home saying, wow, they really value our participation. It's not just the people that showed up in person. So that integration and the strategy behind matching up what an in-person persona wants with what someone at home is going to have to or want to look at, and also budgets. I mean, we're going to have to look at the difference in budgets and integrating how much will you spend, because you're going to have to spend on the digital experience versus the in-person experience. And what can your organization tolerate, and where does the commercialization aspect come into it?
So you talked about personas, people in the room, people outside the room. I think there's also some influencers involved in whether you're even going to go to an event. So how do you see particularly 2021? Because from a European perspective, certainly here in the UK, we're still in lockdown. So you can't have an event. There's also a lot of talk about the inability to get cancellation insurance. So if you have a headliner at a festival and they don't turn up for anything to do with COVID, you're not covered right now. So what are you seeing in the US? It seems to be a little bit more open than here. Are you seeing a different set of challenges that, I mean, not just washing your hands and using anti-bac and whatever else, but are you seeing a different set of challenges about even getting people to go to an event?
Of course. I think that the state-by-state approach that has been taken has definitely impacted how people look at events. Also, their risk profile of who they are. So if you look at the fall and you're interviewing people to say, would you come to an event in New York in September? They may feel differently than will you go to an event in Florida in September? And so I think that we need to take those, those risk preferences into account. And that's why we need to build out different experiences for people who just might not be comfortable yet in the fall, yet we want them to participate, along with those folks who will come out in person to support our events. Being face-to-face is so important. We, of course, as an event industry, want to come back. We want to come back safe, and we want to come back with the community feeling good about the events that we're running.
So when you're talking to your clients and you're looking at these content experiences, what are, I guess, the three pillars that you talk to them about?
I talk a lot about integration, as I discussed before, and looking at your experience on the whole, and not just trying to take kind of like what Golden Globes did, which was an in-person experience, put the speakers up on Zoom and push it out to the masses, versus an in-person and going back to the old ways we used to do things. We have to abandon that. So we have to first look at that strategy and understand how much of a balance you want to strike between both audiences, what kinds of personas do you expect to come, and then who's going to support the event, both from a brand standpoint, a content standpoint, as well as a monetary revenue standpoint, which is obviously so important to commercial organizers. Then the second pillar would be commercialization. Commercialization can mean many different things. I look at it, yes, from a sponsorship perspective. But we also look at it from a brand perspective. Often in blockchain and crypto, we run a lot of these events complementary because the different platforms and protocols really want to get their community together, and they feel this is a give back. So how are you commercializing? How are you maximizing, optimizing that brand within the experience so that these folks feel like they're together, but yet, of the last year, we haven't been able to get together. And then the last thing is execution. And I think that goes directly to what you talked about in the Golden Globes. Having a speaker manager, having prep that really connects with the speaker and is more than just giving them the tech details. I mean, we all could do that when we're in these speaker ready rooms. But talking to them like a person, saying, what are you up to? Getting to know them a little bit as you're in the room. Yes, you're doing 10 different things at once. You're on the chat, you're watching the button, and you're waiting for the next guest. But those connections really matter. And so when you're looking at that from a prep point of view, I find the shows that go best are the ones where the speakers really trust the people who are running the show, and the folks running the show are really talking to them in a way that they would if they're in person. And it's not as stunted, and it's a much more organic conversation that's taking place.
Earlier, you were talking about a little bit of tech and also changing content experiences. So I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. What's the perfect length for a session in a virtual environment? I mean, this one is 25 minutes long. Is that the perfect length, or are there other factors to consider?
Well, it's interesting you raise that, because when the team came to me and said, hey, we'd love to do something with you for this show, we started off with a keynote presentation. And I personally won't give clients the advice to have anyone speaking over 20 minutes without some interaction of someone else being involved in a Q&A. Death by PowerPoint is tough these days. Of course, there are folks who do academic shows, technical shows, scientific shows. I understand the importance of that there. But when you come to more commercialized shows and shows that are in fintech, blockchain, fast-moving organizations, fast-moving industries, 20 to 25 minutes, they're lost in WhatsApp and Telegram and Signal. You can't get them back. So we really try to strive to say, what's the topic about? Can we have even co-moderators, two different people with two different perspectives, interviewing 2 or 3 experts to keep the conversation going? And maybe it's an 18 to 20 minute blip with those speakers. Can you start off a session with a 5-minute level set? Here's my opinion, and then get a group of people reacting. Those are the kinds of sessions that I feel have much more, they're much more dynamic, and they carry the conversation, and people can stay in tune with it and interested in what they're hearing.
And talking about engagement, so by the way, I totally agree with you. I think obviously if it's a scientific explanation, then yeah, maybe a keynote makes sense for a little while, but it's not particularly engaging. Lots of distractions as well. So, you could be checking your email, or as you say, I'm just listening to the audio, but actually I'm doing something on my phone, which probably means I'm not listening as much. Have you seen a change in the way you approach how to design an agenda compared to what you were doing before COVID?
Completely. So when I look back to the pivot that CoinDesk did, and even we had to kind of learn as we went along, we were used to running a half-hour or 45-minute sessions. And it came down to speakers talking to us and us getting a lot more specific about what we wanted out of them. A lot of the times, being really short and candid in a situation like this makes the speaker think a whole lot about what they're going to talk about and the points that they want to make. I also think that in designing these sessions, we've realized that retreats and workshops that were much more hands-on are tougher. They're just tougher to organize. So when you have peer review groups that used to get together for a whole day in a conference room, and it really was very much reliant on the people sitting at the round table, that is a little bit harder when you're trying to do training. So what you try to do is you get maybe 15-minute snippets, and then they go off into either networking rooms on something like Umbrella, or they'll go off into Zoom to meet one another in smaller groups. We try to work around those more interactive sessions, trying to make them feel like they were together, yet they weren't in the same room.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've really noticed that the breakout rooms, which is a relatively new feature on Umbrella, and we're using at this event, it just shakes things up. It allows you to talk to the speaker or to your peers. I've seen some events where they have a breakout room that's just called the cafe, and it's there all day, and you can kind of dip in and out, and people do. Have you noticed any cultural differences? I know that when you were organizing financial events before, you were organizing them all over the world. Does everybody behave in the same way at your virtual conferences?
Well, I think the the cultural differences that we would see from an event in Asia to Europe to the US kind of carry over. And I use that because I think every group's different. It's almost more by industry than it is culture. FinTech events have a certain cadence of how they run. Policy and regulation events with legal folks involved have a certain way. That certainly still carries over. But the one element that I've seen that's similar actually is just that first May, June time period, everyone kind of, oh, wow, this is so scary. And now look, everyone's on this. I mean, whether it's a cocktail hour with your family or a conference or a C-level management group getting together at a very high level for a Fortune 500 company for a board meeting, we've all pretty much acclimated. So now it turns into what's the next pivot, right? Because we're not going to stay in this forever. We are going to come out of our houses. We are going to go to events. And so the question becomes how much of this stays relevant and how much of this is going to be convenience? And then how good does your event value proposition have to be for content, networking, and the overall experience to get them to do that travel? That's going to be the big difference I'm seeing in the future in terms of events that are successful. Those that can get their speakers to really travel and be a part of that speaker scrum at the actual event. Because that's the biggest thing when you look at content, when you can have someone come off stage and you can actually just approach them and talk to them. Brella is terrific. You can do a whole lot of ask me anything. There is something to that conversation. There's something to seeing that person at the, music entertainment event that they have that night. You run into a CEO of a client that you just never expected to meet. These are things that we need more of, along with the virtual convenience. So hopefully with both of those things in place, we can get influencers as well as decision makers on both sides of the table to come to digital experience as well as in person.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the different experiences, isn't it? Because I have a very technical background before doing this job, and we would go to things like South by Southwest Interactive, and a lot of Mobile World Congress is another huge show that we also go to. A lot of the best connections were actually made in the bars or in the coffee shops, or somebody saying, oh, we're having dinner. I mean, this is a South by Southwest thing. We're going for barbecue. Do you want to come? And there'd be somebody there from whichever company you wanted to speak to. What I like about the virtual environment is that it's very easy to find out people's LinkedIn details, to contact them or message them through the platform. So I guess the way I use a lot of these virtual conferences, I'm not necessarily looking for a video call right now. I'm just looking to make a connection. And when I think back to people being on stage, and I'm going to come on to a pretty huge speaker that you've got at your event this month, which you've worked with before. But before I do, a lot of top level speakers are actually quite hard to reach if there's 500 people in the room. So maybe it's just me because I like digital marketing and I kind of get how to navigate it. But I actually think there's a lot of benefit to platforms like Brella. They kind of give me quicker sales leads, quite frankly, make the process a bit easier. I'm not saying I don't like people. I do a little bit, not all the time. But I do think there's actually some speed that can be applied that means I haven't got to fly to Orlando to meet people. I mean, are you seeing a little bit of pushback there, or do you think I'm just a bit odd?
No, I don't think we're seeing, I think you're right about that. I think it's just like a person at the booth that comes back to you as an event organizer and said, I didn't get any leads, right? And it's like, well, what were you doing to engage the folks there? We had the right people at the show. We had the right people on the platform. Did you use the platform? And it's just like when you're at the event, you're just as good as your salesperson a lot of the times. That's what we're seeing, and I think that the pushback will be, okay, where's the new business? And year over year, a lot of comparisons will probably be made to this year, obviously saying, we went virtual on all this, we went to these shows, what did we get on ROI? Then next year, as things come back in 2022, how do we compare those leads? Are we getting much more new business because we're bumping into people in elevators and bars versus that kind of follow-up on some of the virtual? So I think there's going to be a lot of comparisons made and the verdict will be out. But I think it really is going to depend on your sales team. And I think people have to start thinking of sales teams as people who focus really well digitally and can operate on these platforms and network like that all the time. And then those who are more that handshake, and I don't want to use handshake's tough in COVID, but that face-to-face, relationship person, that rainmaker, they tend to be in-person people. And those are a lot of folks that are paying the checks on the organizer side. So, I think we're going to see a lot more of that and a balance. And so I think to answer your question, it's not going to go back to what it was, but I think it'll be a balance of both and checking out those ROIs. Did we get what we want digitally? And also in person, are we seeing the return so we can justify the spend?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about a star speaker that you've got and how you attract talent. So you've got Edward Snowden speaking at an event this month. It's not the first time you've worked with Edward Snowden. And obviously, for those that don't know, he doesn't leave Russia. So he stays in Russia and kind of teleports in, sometimes on a little makeshift, almost robotic screen. How do you go about even getting hold of people like Edward Snowden? And I guess the second question is, why do you look for people like that?
Well, for our first client, Web3 Summit in Berlin, this was way before COVID. So we were looking at speakers that we really felt could connect with the brand. Obviously, his message is all around privacy. He has an interesting story to tell. We took a big chance because there's 1,500 folks that were at Funkhaus in Berlin, all blockchain crypto enthusiasts. And we put him up on 2 giant screens. Funkhaus has some great tech equipment, so it made him really come to life. And when we brought him up there, we really said to ourselves, okay, this is way before COVID. He's got to translate immediately. And so we had somebody in the audience, my client, interviewing him on the floor with everyone kind of very close knit down in this theater, talking, and looking up at the screen. And there was just something of a moment where I think people said, wow, this is some connectivity. Now, you asked me how I found him. We talked with that client a lot about what kind of experience you want to create, who's a showstopper, who's someone that you want to have. Of course, there are always budgets involved, but Edward Snowden doesn't just take any event. So you have to really put a compelling value proposition together. Who's the group? Who's going to interview him? Why should he be talking to your group? And how is he going to communicate and connect with your audience? And that's something that only content experts, you can pay for whatever agency you want, but you have to be able to tell that story and create that narrative. And so we create that narrative, work with someone like that, work really closely with his team to be sure that what we've promised is what we deliver in the end. Funny story about that is we almost didn't have the actual segment because there was construction wherever he was living at the time. So we learned to really adapt quite quickly, and we were able to make it happen. Now that seems like such an easy thing because we've been doing it so regularly, but it just shows us how event design changes. And on the robot, we've thought about that where he basically would be in the robot walking around through this robot with the audience. What a cool way. It might not be Edward Snowden. You can find a committee member or a board chair or someone that might not be able to make an event, and you can pass the robot off to people so that they can kind of have them go around and talk. It's just experimenting with little things like that they really don't cost a whole lot. You can always have the robot sponsored by someone. But these are the kinds of things that you look at and you say, how are you going to bring that in-person experience together with digital? And we did that with him, a couple of years ago. So now for this event, we want to make sure that he's connecting virtually with the audience and making sure he's telling his story in a way that's adaptable virtually. So that's something that we've worked on a second time around, and we're looking forward to having him.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time. What does the future hold for you, as well as this event, which, by the way, is being held on Umbrella, isn't it?
It is. So the event's actually taking place on Umbrella. It's Orchid's private event, PRIV8, for blockchain and crypto enthusiasts in the privacy space.
And future for your business? What kind of thing? I guess, what are you excited about in the next 9 months this year? What's exciting you?
I think just getting back to being out on the road, seeing clients. The reason why I do events is I'm so passionate about people and getting people together. That's a big piece of this, educating people, inspiring people, having them hear something at an event that they're not going to hear on CNBC or hear through a news channel, having a reaction, sitting next to someone that you learn something about somewhere you've never been, traveling, seeing people. It's all that same theme, what we're all craving. But most of all, I'm looking to a new pivot in event design. And that kind of comes back to where we started, because this whole idea of hybrid, I think we need to kind of chuck that a bit. We really need to come back to what's the persona, who's our client, who are the people that we want at the show, and how do they leave feeling, whether they're sitting at home or at the convention center, that they really spent time that was well spent when we are also strapped for time right now to learn something, to meet someone, to do new business. This is why we're in the business. So I'm excited to see where the rest of 2021 brings us, and hopefully even onto a better 2022.
Well, Lauren, I could talk to you for hours. I know you said that 25 minutes or even shorter is the right amount of time, but it's not the right amount of time today because there's so much more we could talk about. I know you're going to be on the platform, so if anybody wants to get in touch with you, you can do that through Brella. But thank you so much for sharing your experience of designing content experiences for the future.
Thank you so much. Have a great one, guys.
And that brings us to the end of this session. If you haven't yet booked your meetings on Brella, please click on the icon top right on your screen. You'll see some meeting requests there, hopefully. If you don't, why don't you badger somebody else and arrange a meeting? Also, remember the roundtables. They're on a range of subjects. If you're interested in AV, in live streaming, which is my specialist subject, you can come and ask us anything. So a little bit of a Reddit shout out there. If you've got any questions about live streaming for hybrid events, for virtual events, we are in one of the roundtables. That's it for now. We'll be back shortly with Heather for the next session.